So when you sign on to love and follow Jesus, it's a call to another way of living. It's not evidence that you have arrived or that you're perfect or that you're elevated above anybody else. In fact, there is no elevation at all in the journey of life with Jesus. One of my favorite chapters in the whole of the book of Romans is Romans 12, the chapter that we're at today and next week. In fact, it was the chapter that Pastor Sharon and I had read and talked about by one of the 7 ministers at our wedding 30 years ago on December 17th coming. Paul gives some great advice in this chapter on how to live as followers of Jesus. We've spent several months now looking at this book of Romans from chapter 1 all the way through to where we are in chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 today. And the book that we have in the Romans that we have now in book form was originally a letter that Paul, the apostle, wrote to the church in Rome because they were struggling with some issues. Some of the issues they were struggling with were how do they include people who weren't of Jewish background in the church? And they really shouldn't have struggled with this because the Jews weren't Christians until they met Jesus and began to follow him, and then that began to grow. The Christian faith began to grow. And not only were they struggling with how to include non-Jews in the church, but those of Jewish background were struggling with how do they let go of, what do they let go of from their background, their faith background, their perspective, their history, now that they and live as followers of Jesus. So Jesus arrived on the scene and he taught the early Jews that following him required living by another way. A way with far less emphasis on rules and regulations. A way that's filled with love, receiving and giving love, and repeating. And Paul then picks up on this teaching of Jesus and shares it here in chapter 12. This call to another way of living is a call to be transformed. It's not a call to wear a label, to have a bumper sticker on your car that says you're a Christian, to wear a gold necklace around your neck, or to get some kind of tattoo, or to wear a t-shirt that has some Christian saying on. It's not a call to that. It's a call to live a lifestyle, to live in the way of Jesus. It's not a subscription to a bunch of rules and regulations, but it is a commitment to love that is expressed in our relationships with each other and our relationship with God. Paul was writing to both those who already were a part of the church and those who would come and become part of the church. Now, in the past, I preach a variety of ways. I tell stories, I tie it in. And this morning, what I want to do is I want to kind of look at each verse a little bit and talk about each verse by verse, called expository preaching. And so I want to look at verse 1 and talk about it, and then verse 2 and talk about it and go on and on. So verse 1, Paul says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind that God will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him." So Paul is calling us to live our lives in relationship with God, to live our lives in worship of God and honoring God because of what God has done in our lives. He's not calling us to an hour a week, or in this case of this service, an hour and a half a week, or 2 hours, depending on how long the preacher goes. And it's the same preacher at 9 o'clock as it is at 10:30. I said the other week about that, and Christina said, who preaches at 9? I said that the early service preacher was long-winded, and she said, well, who preaches at 9? I said, well, it's the same preacher at 9:30. It's the same deal when the secretary has typos. It's a call to live our lives always, every day, in a way that worships and honors God because of what He has offered us in His Son Jesus. His love, His forgiveness, His grace, and the salvation that He offers us. And then Paul goes on in the rest of this chapter and gets specific about how we live that life, that calling, that other way of living, how we live our lives in worship and honor of God. And in verse 2, he says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world. Wow. Think about hearing that as a Jew. Think about hearing that as a Gentile. Think about hearing that now. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Now, isn't that interesting? When you, probably in the churches, if you grew up in a church or probably in churches you've been in, you hear the preacher and a lot of people talking about the heart. Invite Jesus into your heart. But here Paul's saying, change the way you think. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Now think about that. Don't copy the behaviors of this world. He's talking about living by a different way. Following Jesus doesn't mean living by the ways of the world. We're set apart. We're different. But let me be clear, we are not elevated. The way of Jesus is to take on the role of a servant. He says the greatest of all will be the servant of all. That's why the image this morning of a server with a towel, prepared to serve. Far too many Christians think they're elevated above the rest of the world, and we point fingers and we push people down and we put people aside. No, 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 no. We're a servant. We're here to serve. I've decided my next tattoo is going to be, I am but a servant, and it's going to be right here on my arm. And I'm serious. It's going to happen real soon. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Brothers and sisters, the key to transformation isn't in your heart. It's in your mind. It's in the way we think. It was true for the Jews who began following Jesus. It was true for the Gentiles that began following Jesus too. And it is true for us as well. Just prior to gathering here for worship, I was talking to two people among us who were having the challenge placed before them to get straight A's. They've never done that. And their perspective was they can't do it. Well, if you think you can't, you won't. But if you change your mind and you begin to think, I can do this, you can get close to it, if not get it. Perspective is everything. In our minds, what we think and how we think about things is incredibly important. Our minds are a powerful tool, and what we think has a way of binding us or setting us free. Perception is reality far too often in our lives and in our world. Did you hear me? Perception is reality far too often. But reality is really reality, and reality isn't always perception. Case in point, National Folk Festival. We've been hearing for months, that 60 to 80,000 people are coming to Salisbury. Now, 60 to 80,000 people didn't come. And it's good that they didn't, but it's been a wonderful event. And anybody that cries about how wonderful it was because there weren't 60 to 80,000 people here is wrong. So 60 to 80,000 people were going to come to Salisbury. And so the perception is, where in the world will we park? So they set up parking at the old mall, and they're busing people in. The first night, Friday night, Sharon and I decided we would park here at our parking lot and walk up Waverly, and it would be fine. And as we walked up, we saw all kinds of places we could have parked along Waverly Drive. At the laundromat, at the back of where the gospel shop used to be, where Recovery Resource Center is now. There was all kinds of parking that we could have parked closer, but we didn't. Lots of people didn't support downtown businesses because there were road closures and all of that earlier in the week. Because perception, again, was that there's no parking. They took the parking lot, the free parking lot by the library where you can park for 2 hours for free, and put tents up early in the week. And so everybody's like, where are we going to park? Where are we going to park? Yesterday, in the heart of the festival, when the crowd was the biggest, a friend of mine went in the parking garage, which now you can see because it's the brightest building in Salisbury, and took that picture. There's 800 parking spots in the parking garage, and there's probably 100 on the top of the parking garage, and there it was empty at the heart of the festival. See, the perception was that there's no parking close by. But the reality was that there was incredible parking close by. In fact, we parked on Market Street right up next to the old, what was Headquarters Live, which before that was the fire company, the fire headquarters downtown. We had less than 100 yards to walk to get to the festival. And we even saw Luke, and he was being you'd be proud of him. He was reading the signs, and his pastor taught him to not pay attention to the signs. The sign said, "Private parking, your car will be towed." And that's the lot we were in. And he was pulling out of it when we saw him. We said, "Hey, come back in there. There's places in there. Go park." And he did. See, I happen to know that insurance company that has that parking lot has closed and has moved to Pennsylvania. And so there's no reason. And it was a Saturday anyhow. So why not park in that lot? Yeah. But you see and so changing your mindset is incredible. It sets us free. And my point really isn't to talk about the National Folk Festival. It's to talk about where changing our mind, how that transforms us. Changing our minds, the way we think, is the key to life transformation. I participated in a 10-month community conversation on race. Sitting with brothers and sisters of color and hearing their stories and experiences with prejudice and racism and systemic racism in our country has greatly impacted my thinking and the way I live. Because when it impacts my thinking, then it impacts my life and the way I live. Unfortunately, we live in a society where white people are in positions of power and advantage, and the systems that are in our culture still seek to put down and keep people of color in their place, quote unquote. Participation in this conversation, listening to my brothers and sisters and hearing their stories has opened my mind, and it has greatly changed the way I live. Life transformation, brothers and sisters, begins in our minds. Verse 3, Paul goes on, and he says in verse 3, he says, "Because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us." Well, hear this. To those who were in the church and struggling with letting foreigners in, he's saying, don't think you're better than you are. To those who are foreigners coming into the church, don't think you're better than you are. To those of us who are in the church today, don't elevate yourselves. Don't put yourself up there on a pedestal. You're just as bad and you're just as much a sinner as everybody else. Don't think you're better than anyone else. The greatest of all is the servant of all. We need to learn that. It's always easy to elevate ourselves. But as I said in the beginning, the way of Jesus is not about elevation. It's about humbling ourselves and serving others in love. And then Paul moves in verse 4, he moves into giving us this, I think it's a really helpful metaphor for what we're to be. In verse 4, he says, just as our bodies have many parts and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body and we all belong to each other. Well, that's a really helpful metaphor about how we're supposed to function as a church. We're all a part of one body. Now, our bodies have different parts, and those parts have different functions. I mean, I can see you right now because I'm looking at you through my eyes. I can't see you through my hand. And if I hold my hand in front of my eyes, I can't even see you through my eyes. Different functions. They all have a function. They all have a role. And when you don't have ability to use some part of your body that you were used to using, you realize the importance of the function that had. And as we age, that happens. And there's Ralph. I mean, I saw him reach down and hit his leg. He's missing part of a leg. But, we've come up with this great way of making a new leg. That's incredible, really, when you think about the way it allows you to get around easier than not having it. And so, all of us are different parts of the one body. You heard it in the song. It was beautiful when Joy was singing. It was more beautiful when Kelly joined in, and even more beautiful when Jenna joined in, and even more when Gary and the rest of the team joined in. And Tanya, we still have to figure out a way to get that microphone to pick you up a little more. But it illustrated beautifully what Paul's talking about here. We all have a function in the body, and we're all important. Just as our body has many parts, so too does the church. And each one of you is important to the whole. And then in verses 6 through 8, Paul begins talking about gifts. And I want to just read these verses and then we'll talk a little bit about them and we'll be done. In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, then serve them well. If you're a teacher, teach well. If your gifts are to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving generously, give. If God has given you leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. What a beautiful instruction. In His grace, God has given each of us gifts. Each of you have a gift. Do you know what your gift is? Just after the first service, we were talking about this and somebody walked out and they were saying to me and their spouse, I don't know what my gift is. And this guy's in his 70s. I think. He might be in his 60s. And I said, right away, I know what your gift is. You're gifted with the ability to serve. You have eyes to see that, because I was going to pick up the hymnals to take the container and move them. And he said, no, I'll get that. So right there was your gift. Well, I don't feel like I can use it very often. You got to find all kinds of little ways. I'm sure there are little ways that he uses that gift because because of his gifting, he sees opportunities to hold the door, to do something to serve others. Each of us has a gift. And if you don't know what your gift is, just ask somebody who's close to you what your gift is, because they'll help you. And if you think you have a gift, ask them, is this my gift? And if they say no, don't be offended. Because sometimes we think we have a gift that we really don't have. And we don't find fulfillment if we're living out of gifts that we don't have. When we live out of the gifts we have, when we are true to what the gift God has given us, we find incredible fulfillment. And the gift isn't for us. It's for us as the body. It's not for me. My gifts aren't for me. My gifts are for you. Your gifts aren't for you. Your gifts are for us. And for honoring and glorifying God. When we use our gifts, when we use those things God gives us, it brings honor to God. And we need each of those gifts. I mean, if all of us were preachers, had the gift of preaching, gift of speaking, we'd be fighting for control. We'd be fighting for who's going to say what. If all of us were singers, you don't want me up there leading your singing. I mean, I love to sing, but it's not my gift. So it's important that we know what our gifts are, and it's also important that we recognize that each one of us is important to the whole. I mean, I know how to be hospitable, but when I put out a meal for somebody, I'm just going to, you'll eat. But I might not do the little touches that make it nice and fancy. So when we go to Pinehurst and we put out the cookies, we call on Karen. We call on Sally. We call on somebody who has the gift of hospitality, who knows how to do the fancy, the little extra touches that make it look special. If you call on Martin, we're just going to lay the cookies out on sheets, or we'll just put them in the containers that you brought them in, and you know, we're blessing them. See, we need each other. We need all the gifts that we have. And knowing what isn't your gift is important as knowing your gift. And when you're asked to do something that's not in your gift, to say no to it is freeing. And I want to give you permission. If you get asked to do something that's not in your gift, it's okay to say no and not feel guilty about it. I mean, for the folk festival, I was invited to be on the green team, the team that works with recycling and having as little trash that goes out of this affair as possible. And I attended one meeting, and it was clear to me that was not my gift. I mean, I care about recycling. I care about our environment, but it was not my gift to sit in a meeting and figure out how we were going to do that. And so I said, thank you for thinking of me, but you'll be better served by getting somebody else to sit in my chair, or having nobody sit in my chair and just using the people that were already there. So it's okay to know and to say no when you're being asked to use something that's not your gift. See, being part of the church, being a follower of Jesus, means that we will live our lives differently from the world. Another way of living. Our lives are dedicated to loving and serving Jesus by loving and serving others. And when we do that, we'll find incredible fulfillment. And our relationship with Christ goes to a whole new level. And it becomes beautiful. So I've talked enough. How do you want to respond? What stories, any stories, new stories, not the stories we already shared, any ways you want to engage with this?